Paul Maynard.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to speak in this debate. Paragraph 13 of the final McNulty report states quite clearly, and I quote, that fare structures do not send efficient pricing signals, particularly in terms of managing peak demand, and are extremely complex. As a frequent user of the West Coast Main Line, I can only concur with that diagnosis. But what has struck me about the debate today has been the absence, indeed the lack, of any praise for what the government is actually doing to tackle this. And I'm not just talking about it being RPI plus 1 rather than RPI plus 3, nor about the fact that we have more passengers on our rails than the 1920s now. But I do find it strange that the opposition find it difficult to recognise the investment we're making, particularly in the northwest, the Ordsall Core, that first stage of the northern hub, the electrification we're seeing to Blackpool, for example, as before we get on to HS2, which I'm sure both opposition frontbenchers are perhaps suffering a degree of HS2 fatigue over. So I sat there listening to the speech from the Honourable Lady, the Shadow Secretary of State, and I began to ask myself, is this really the new reality? Is this the new approach for tough times? Or is it actually just about borrowing a bit more? The same old story, the same old solution, without saying where it's going to come from? And that isn't just a knockabout point, it actually goes to the heart of transport policy. The last Labour government, quite rightly in my view, took the view that it wanted to shift the burden of paying for our railways from the taxpayer to the fare-paying passenger, a policy that this government is continuing with. And I'm now not quite sure I understand why the current Labour opposition don't wish to continue with that. And I began to get a bit confused. I almost felt, listening to the Honourable Lady, that I was watching a game of what I call policy twister, where a front bench team tries to contort itself into new poses to fit in with the leader's latest relaunch. As someone who's spent many years on a front bench opposition team, I know what it feels like, and I've been there, done that, bought the T-shirt. But I don't want to denigrate some of the proposals the Honourable Lady did come up with. I thought they made, some of them, a lot of sense. I do have concerns about the digital divide and the availability of online fares only. She was quite right to raise that, for example. But I do feel that in this wider debate as a whole, we need to have a slightly more coherent understanding of what the McNulty Review is actually recommending. And I am concerned that it just seems to focus on what the latest RMT or TSSA press release is actually saying. It isn't just about ticket officers. And by the by, I share many people's concerns about the loss of ticket officers. But I do think that we do actually need to understand that McNulty goes much further than that. And that somewhere within rail policy overall, we have to have the discussion about where the burden lies, where the balance lies between the fare-paying passenger and the taxpayer. And if McNulty calls for a fare review, and we are delivering a fare review at the end of the year, I'm a little perplexed as to why the opposition couldn't wait to see what was in the fare review. I'm proud to serve on the Transport Select Committee. I'm looking forward to cross-examining the documents when they come forward. I have no doubt we will find some flaws, and we will communicate those flaws in our usual courteous way to the government. And I think that will be a good thing. But we have to recognise that there's a command paper coming out that will look at the structure of our railways. There's a fares review coming out that will address the issues as well. But where the Honourable Lady, I think, does illustrate a useful point, I thought, was when she confirmed to me that one of her core beliefs is that the peak period should be the same in Euston as it is in Merseyside. And that raised some very interesting problems, I would have thought, in my point of view. Anyone who uses the West Coast Main Line, as I'm sure she does to get back to Liverpool, must realise that at peak hours on a Friday, the place is a hellhole. They have to put passengers in cattle pens. It's not acceptable. If she is suggesting that we reduce the standard national peak time, that would just cause that problem at Euston every day of the week and make it worse. If she is suggesting that we have a much longer national peak hour, it would actually make it quite hard for many of my parents' neighbours, for example, who travel from Runcorn into Lime Street to do their shopping in Liverpool 1, to get there and back in a day on an off-peak ticket. So it's an example, I think, of where her policies that she's suggesting today are not really thought through. And I would far rather that she recognise the fact that the government is taking steps in this direction, is making a difference, and actually is bringing forward the fares review, the command paper on the structure of the rail industry that we actually need to see. I have a feeling this debate might have been plonked upon them from above. I know it does happen sometimes. You don't always choose to have a debate, but you get told, oh, you're having one, and that they've done their best to cobble together a press release. I'm afraid, you know, I get A+ for effort, but D- for homework. There is a debate to be had here. I'm not sure that today was the one that we wanted to be having, though.